Welcome, 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 and welcome, 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 welcome. 5 more welcomes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us, part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, academics, writers, columnists, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right. We don't care. We want to get a variety of perspectives from thoughtful people and provide it directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. It's not as popular these days, but perhaps we'll have a renaissance. With us today is Chris C. Martin. He's a lecturer who works in the field of psychology at Oglethorpe. And he's here because of Kimberly Rios. We want to say thank you, Kimberly Rios. This is our second recommended interviewee we've done today. Thank you, Kim Rios. Appreciate it. The professor has a BA in psychology from Davidson College and MS in human-computer interaction at the Georgia Institute of Technology, good school, and master's in experimental psychology, College of William and Mary, and a PhD in sociology from Emory University. He studies well-being and happiness and political and moral psychology. He also teaches Introduction to Psychology, Science of Happiness, Human Nature, and Social Order, and Science and Human Nature. He also wrote this article, How Ideology Has Hindered Sociological Insight in the American Sociologist. American sociology has consistently leaned towards the political left. This ideological skew hinders sociological insight in 3 ways. He also wrote this article, How Education Did and Did Not Accentuate Partisan Differences During the Ebola Outbreak, 2014-2015. So he's dabbled in political ideology, and he has an extensive education in sociology and psychology, and has studied political ideology. Professor, did I get anything wrong with your background, or is there something we need to cover?
No, that's perfect.
So let me start off with the main question. Is political polarization real? Is it a problem? Or we've had problems before in America, and the media is just hyping this up to, get views. And it's not really as big an issue as they say.
There is polarization. There are various kinds of polarization, and various things you can mean by it, but by virtually any definition, there's polarization. It's not definitely a bad thing, because one type of polarization you can have is polarization on an issue, and sometimes you need polarization on an issue to generate a conflict in which the right side wins. The right side being the side on the side of human rights or dignity. So in the case of the pre-Civil War period in U.S. history, was a period of intense polarization. And in an alternate universe, maybe everyone who was eligible to vote in the 1850s would have been pro-slavery. In that case, there would have been no polarization, but that would have been a worse world. One of the reasons slavery ended was that America was polarized. There were people who were pro-slavery and then people who were anti-slavery. People who were anti-slavery weren't necessarily anti-slavery for human rights reasons, as we would say today, but at least they were anti-slavery. There was a mix of reasons there behind Lincoln's election. And that eventually led to the end of slavery. It led to the Civil War, which was the result of polarization, but the Civil War led to the Emancipation Proclamation. So polarization or division on its own isn't necessarily just a good or bad thing. I think people like the idea of harmony. So polarization seems like the antonym of harmony. And people think, well, you can either have harmony or you can have polarization. All things considered, I prefer harmony. Maybe in a household, sure, harmony is better. I don't know if you're married. Married, partnered, whatever, harmony generally is better. But at the national level, if something's at stake, it's better to have some division rather than everyone going with a bad policy or some sort of violation of human rights.
Like the few Germans who said, no, we shouldn't listen to that guy Hitler. He's going to lead us down a bad path. They would have been not liked by the other Nazi supporters. That'd be a polarized situation, but they would have been right.
Yeah. So division isn't necessarily bad, but we have, you've interviewed some of the people who study this. I saw you interviewed Alan Abramowitz. He studies one kind of polarization Other people study affective polarization, which is emotionally having an aversive reaction to people who vote for a different party and anything associated with them. So it can mean a variety of things. You can be talking about the public, you can be talking about politicians who are in Congress. Those are two different subjects. So it can mean a variety of things.
You have one party says, we're going to hold the belief that the guy that you elected as president wasn't actually elected president. And we're basically going to deny that he's our president for 4 years. In response, the other party says, oh, was that your guy you elected? We're going to deny that he's president for 4 years. And then we had a group of people storm the Capitol for the first time since 1812. Those events are not normal in American history. I understand we've had polarizing periods, but that is definitively different historically. Could we then say that we're at a new and scary period of polarization, given that things like that never happened in the last 200 years?
Yeah, we are in a new and scary period. I mean, sometimes people do like to feel like this is symmetric, and it's actually quite asymmetric. So Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann have a really good book about this called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. The second edition is called It's Even Worse Than It Was. Back when I hosted a podcast called Half Hour of Heterodoxy, I had an interview with Norm Ornstein. You can look that one up if you're curious. But Norm has done plenty of interviews about this book. Other people have as well. And what essentially happened is, after controlling the House of Representatives for about 40 years or so, so the Democratic Party controlled the House for about 40 years until 1995. And during that period, towards the end, the Democrats did abuse their power to some degree. However, Newt Gingrich decided that the only way to gain power was to just be a radically polarizing figure, and that led to the rise of the Gingrich senators, which then led to the Republican Party being willing to engage in more unprecedented tactics. So one of the things Gingrich did was what we now call hostage taking. He created a government shutdown. We had another government shutdown, or the threat of a government shutdown, when Mitch McConnell and Obama, when Obama was president and Mitch McConnell was the majority leader in the Senate. So it is the Republican Party that has generally done things like hostage taking. They've done things called, there's something called the new nullification. I don't know if you've talked to anyone about that, but that's where you effectively nullify a government agency by refusing to appoint a head of the agency. So the Senate can block appointments, and one thing you can do is, if we follow the democratic process, create an agency, you can then just veto anyone who's supposed to be the head of the agency. You've got that nullification going on. You've got the abuse of the filibuster going on as well. So Republicans started to do that during the Clinton presidency, and now it's basically a norm for Republicans. Democrats have retaliated, so they did. Every time you see a spike in the use of the filibuster, you see Democrats following up with an equal number, but not raising the bar. And then Republicans come into power again, and they raise the bar. So even though the founders intended the Senate to work in a majoritarian fashion, so right now that would be 51 senators support something, and it passes, we now have the Republican Party filibustering everything. So we do have, this problem of the Republican Party using more and more extreme tactics, and that is a problem. I think one of the things I like about the Mann and Ornstein book is it also ends with a chapter called Bromides to Avoid, in which the authors talk about solutions that'll work and solutions that won't. So a third party probably won't work, even though it seems like a good idea. There's a justification for that there. What will work is making voting mandatory, having things like ranked choice voting. And some parts of the US are now using ranked choice voting. There are petitions in other parts of the country to start using ranked choice voting. So there, if you aren't the first choice, it helps to be the second choice. You get some benefit from being everyone's second choice. So if you're an extremely polarizing figure, you're never really anyone's second choice. You're either their first choice or the last choice. So it helps to have some appeal. And Australia has mandatory voting. It will also help to make Election Day a holiday, a national holiday, or to put Election Day, to have elections on a holiday. That would help a lot too. And then essentially you need more people voting.
So if you had more people voting,
yeah,
and we would have less polarization.
Well, you'd have less dysfunction, but you have less polarization too, because you'd have, I mean, a lot of disengaged voters are people who are not as close to one extreme. So you can think of it this way: there's a block of people who are not voting. If we had mandatory voting, so if it were illegal to not vote, as in Australia, those people would have to show up to the polls. And so politicians would have to start appealing to those people who are roughly in the middle. So you'd have politicians making appeals to people in the middle rather than to people at the extremes.
Right now we have people who are at the extremes are very enthusiastic voters, so politicians make their appeals to them rather than to a broad middle section, which they would have to do if everyone was required to vote. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yeah, that's roughly what I'm saying.
We saw the election with Donald Trump and Joseph Biden, and they said record voter turnout for Biden. It was also record voter turnout for Trump. Not as well acknowledged, but he brought a lot of people out because, hey, it was all on the line. So we had more people vote on both sides, and it was just as polarized. How does that mean that more voters is the way out?
Well, it was record voter turnout by a few percentage points. It wasn't anywhere close to 100% of people voting. So there was still a huge segment of people not voting. So the
news said record turnout, never before so many people voting. I mean, they made it seem like everybody came out.
Yeah, I don't know the exact figures, but if I recall, it was maybe 2 or 3 points higher than the previous election.
So not record turnout, really.
Yeah. So
even when it's all on the line, American democracy is at a threat. We could really only get about 3% more people to come out.
Yeah. Well, for a lot of people, there's a daily routine they have and a weekly routine they have, and they just go through their life living that routine, and politics doesn't. Well, who the president is doesn't seem to affect their lives that much. This is not just true in the United States. This is true throughout the world. One reason people don't vote is they feel like it doesn't make a difference to them. So that's not a uniquely American problem. But even during the Trump presidency, there were a lot of people going around. I mean, he did not start a land war in the United States, which would have, actually, I don't know how you would do that. I guess you could invade Mexico or Canada. But, that's the only sort of thing that affects the daily lives of people immediately. Other than that, life goes on as normal. I mean, you also have the opposite problem, or the inverse, which is people blaming the president for things that the president has very little control over, things like inflation, the stock market. They have some control over, who the chairman of the Fed is, but inflation is largely driven by forces that the president can control, often something like global warming or a general strike in some country or the after effects of a pandemic. So,
so we've never had a time where everybody was required to vote. If we did, we could get a lot more moderates. It sounds like you're saying the key is to get a lot of the disengaged and the moderates back involved. People who aren't as polarized.
Mm-hmm.
Get the non-polarized people back involved.
That's one solution. I mean, another problem with the way the United States is structured is that we have an electoral college and we have, similar things at the state level. We don't have electoral colleges, but we have a problem whereby Republicans can lose the vote but still gain the presidency. So
Thank you.
the voting is and get fewer votes. This happened in 2000 and happened again in 2016. So one problem is the Republican Party doesn't have to appeal as much. I mean, the bar is still pretty high for them. They have to win something, but they don't have to worry as much about sheer numbers as the Democrats. Not only have to win a presidency, the Democratic candidate not only has to win a majority of voters, but a majority of voters in lots and lots of key states in order to win a majority of electoral votes. So Ezra Klein's book on polarization called Why We're Polarized, that's a really good book about this topic. And in general, the Democratic Party is a bit more like a law firm or a firm that's been engaged by voters with several different issues. So labor unions tend to support the Democratic Party. Feminists, who are a bit entirely different contingency, tend to support the Democratic Party. African Americans, who are an entirely different contingency, different set of voters, tend to vote for the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party is like this coalition, it's this big umbrella. There's a give and take. The Republican Party is more of this ideological party where people who vote Republican want the party to be ideologically pure and are less in favor of compromise. So it would also be nice if we had more Republican voters who were in favor of the Republican Party being open to compromise. David Hopkins and Matt Grossman have a really good book on this. I think it's called Asymmetric Politics, and they would be good people to interview.
Thank you.
They show that if you look, if you poll voters, a majority of Democratic voters say that Democratic politicians should be open to compromise, whereas a majority of Republican voters say that their candidates should not be open to making compromises. And so you do see, I mean, there are some key figures in the Republican Party, like Lauren Boebert, who are definitely anti-compromise. And you actually see people, who are like not quite as far to the right, still very right wing, but not quite as far to the right, like blanking on his first name now, but Boehner, who was the
John Boehner.
John Boehner. He's out now because he made just a small number of compromises.
Right.
That was enough. Eric Cantor, another case of person very conservative, but was willing to make some compromises. Sorry?
Eric Cantor was for the Tea Party, I believe. He was a Tea Party hero.
Yeah, he was Tea Party-ish, yeah, but apparently not far enough. Liz Cheney, very conservative in general, but did support investigating.
True, and she's on the outs with the Republican Party now.
Yeah,
how I heard, Trump was president for 4 years.
Mhm.
Hell no, I'll work with him. I don't want anything to do with him. I won't even be in the same room with him. I'll never vote on anything he did with him. I'll never meet with him. I'm in California. We had tons of politicians at the federal and state level doing that. AOC and the squad did that. How does that represent willing to compromise when for 4 years, basically you could have nothing to do with Trump in any capacity that was anything positive at all? How does that mean the Democrats are the party of willingness to compromise? Because they really went with, we're not compromising on anything with Trump for 4 years.
If you want to delve into this in detail, Ezra Klein's book is good. It's even worse than it looks is good as well. But for example of compromise, you could look at the Affordable Health Care Act. The Clintons in 1994 tried to pass affordable health care, a version of an Affordable Health Care Act, and they failed. An alternative was proposed by the Republican Party. And so, as a sign of compromise, what the Democratic Party did was took that Republican proposal and molded it into the Affordable Care Act. And it's hard to envision the Republican Party doing something like that. And in the Senate, it was Obama had the presidency, Democrats had a majority, but it was a bipartisan coalition of Democrats and Republicans who worked on the act. So again, Democrats made some compromises before the final version of the act made it to Congress. So when it comes to actual legislation, there's the squad, which is a group of about 4, maybe 5 people who are fairly resistant to compromise. Although I'm not an expert on their voting record, but there are a lot of Democrats who will negotiate on legislation and make some trade-offs to make sure it passes. And what you saw with the Affordable Health Care Act is even though the entire act was based on a Republican proposal that was supposed to be an alternative to the Clinton plan, at the end of the day, no Republicans in the Senate, they said they were going to support it because it was an essentially conservative solution. It was not Medicare for all. But at the end, none of them actually did support it. So you see the asymmetry there. That's the most famous example.
Sure. Fair. Totally fair. Totally fair. I just see things like the January 6th hearings. We needed everybody in America to get behind that because that was a coup and it was horrible and our Capitol was stormed. Pelosi decided to basically cut all the Republicans from the thing. So right off the bat, that hearing was polarized, and that was from the Dems not allowing it. Then we had the Qasem Soleimani execution. He was an Iranian Quds Force general. He had orchestrated the death of about 1,500 Americans. Nobody on the left could celebrate when Donald Trump killed him. In fact, he was criticized for doing that. We couldn't even come together when a man who murdered over 1,000 Americans couldn't back it. And then my favorite one was the squad. Every time the squad voted with Trump, which happened a couple times, it was only on allowing more spying on the domestic population or allowing more weapons to war out externally. Big surprise. They would never point that out. So, hey, we agreed with Trump on something. Don't tell anybody. Don't bring it up. So you're right. There's some working together on legislation, but I can also see some moments where you had the chance to reach out and you didn't. I also remember the first year of Obama's term, Frontline documentary by PBS did a show on this. And there was about a 3 to 4 month period where Obama was aloof and unwilling to meet with the Republicans early on. He thought, I'm president, you should come to me. That was not traditionally the way that it was done with the Senate-President relationship. And that sort of created an icy thing. That's not my take. That's Frontline by PBS when they were looking at the healthcare debate. When we go to other things, we want to talk about violence. Now, the Republican Party stormed the Capitol on January 12th. Wrong, bad, violent, bad, wrong. But can we say that the Democrats have not also encouraged violence? Has it been just the Republicans who dabbled with violent language, or is there some instances of the Democrats also doing that?
I don't know. So jumping back to the January 6th hearings, the Republicans decided to boycott those hearings, so it was not a decision by Nancy Pelosi per se that caused a number of Republicans to be small. I mean, there were,
that was after she removed the nominations.
Liz Cheney, and one other Republican were on the committee, but it was, it became a talking point because Republicans claim that they've been excluded, but they actually self-opted out. But on the topic of violence, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the leading candidates for the presidency among Democrats. I don't think Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton really ever encouraged violence.
No.
Sorry?
No, not really. There was the one time that Obama went to a rally and he said, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight. But they kind of it wasn't really here or there.
Okay.
That's all they have on them.
I mean, of the Republicans who were candidates, in the primaries in 2016, 2015, 2016, definitely the one who encouraged violence the most was Donald Trump. His rallies were known, before he was president even, his rallies were
Absolutely.
known for being somewhat violent. So, um, Kasich definitely never advocated violence. The others were probably more extreme, but I still don't think any of them would have actually advocated violence in the way that Donald Trump did.
What about when Joseph Biden goes on television and says, I'm so angry at Donald Trump, I want to punch him in the face? Is that
mm,
not advocating violence?
so I don't know the context in which he said that.
Okay.
The
He said
context.
it. I'll try to find out the reference. He said that.
Okay.
We also have Chris Cuomo on CNN when he was popular saying, if you get into a political disagreement with someone, it's okay to punch them in the face. Said that live on TV on CNN, not criticized by Democrats. Biden wasn't Democrat. Criticized. We also have Kamala Harris when she was on the Ellen DeGeneres show, joked about executing Donald Trump, which is a felony. And then she got promoted to vice president. I had a debate with a professor an hour ago. Yes, that happened.
Okay.
And then my favorite one is AOC when she got into a disagreement with Ted Cruz, and this was after January 6th, and she directly accused him of attempting to murder her, and nothing like that was true.
Okay.
Are these can't be good examples? I understand the Republicans, January 6th was over the top, but to have the other side suggest occasionally it's okay to punch someone in the face and not be criticized by their party, that's not good either, right?
And I agree. It's not. I mean, in general, that's not something you would see. I mean, given Joe Biden's history, because he's had this long political career, he has a long history of compromising with other Democrats and Republicans to create policy in the 70s and 80s. So I'm surprised that he would say that. If it wasn't in a context where he was clearly being facetious or something. I mean, I'm curious about the rest of what he said, but in general, no, that's not a good thing that he said that. It's not a good thing that Chris Cuomo said that. It is a symptom of polarization in the sense that you would not have heard. Well, I don't think you would have heard candidates, actual elected officials, saying that in the 60s or 70s. I mean, what you did see though is in this, until the 60s, there was this consensus, this silent consensus between Republicans and Democrats that it was okay to suppress black voters and okay to suppress civil rights. And that
Right.
so one reason for weaker polarization was that there were essentially not so many agreements, or not so many disagreements about civil rights. And the Democratic Party, well, there were two wings, the Southern and Northern Democrats. And the Southern Democrats were quite racist in order to hold the whole party together.
Yeah.
Northern Democrats compromised on that. So, they did implicitly support violence against Black Americans, both parties, even though they didn't talk about being violent towards the other party. So there was a way in which parties supported violence. They implicitly supported racial violence.
And that's wrong and bad. And suggesting that a party, anybody's okay to attack minorities is wrong or bad. My family's Mexican. They came from Texas. I'm actually Tejano, which is the Mexicans that were in Texas before it was invaded and taken over. So I definitely understand that story. What I'm concerned about is certainly the Republicans have done worse. And I left the Republican Party in 2012 because I was afraid they were going to become racist. And that was 4 years before Trump. I saw the election between Romney and Obama. And Romney had ties to Mexico and spoke Spanish and chose to say absolutely nothing about that because he didn't want to be associated with Mexicans. George W. Bush had 50% of the Latin vote. Romney dropped that down to 20%. So I knew when he was facing a diversified America, which was represented by President Barack Obama awesomely, that they were saying, nah, we don't really want these Latin voters. We'll go for something else. And the next thing they did was Trump. So I saw the writing on the wall. Totally agree with you. want to be careful to say it's all one side and nothing has ever happened on the other side. Because for right there it is, Joseph Biden. I beat the hell out of him, and I want to punch him in the face. So that took about 3 seconds on Google. That's there. That can't be a good sign to have our president talk about how he's the decent one, the return to normalcy, the decent American, the opposite of Donald Trump, and then use rhetoric like this that looks similar to Donald Trump's. That can't be good, can it?
No, it's not good.
Also, Maxine Waters. I remember Maxine Waters, famously from California. She said, if you ever see a Trump supporter with their family at a restaurant, get right up in their face and accost them. Never criticized. I mean, we talked about that tons because she's famous out here in California. And I go, that seems like a good way to start things and make them go violent. No. She also pushed a reporter out of the way, but he was conservative. So, you know. New nullification. Certainly, I remember what you're talking about during Barack Obama's presidency. He was trying to get many agencies up and running, and they played with him a lot. Hey, we're just not going to approve your appointee. So he had to do these like interim placements where he couldn't call them the actual president. They were the interim president. And then they'd be interim for years, right? Because they go, we're not going to confirm you as president. Fine. I'm still putting the top person in the driver's seat. You don't want to call him president? We'll call him whatever, but they're still running the organization. So we had interim presidents for years. It was ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. But what about
ambassadorships too? So there was one case of an ambassador not being confirmed, and she actually died because the wait was so long.
Oh my God!
She had an illness, but she was, and the senator who had put a hold on her was a senator or congressman. Regardless, it was a Republican senator who thought she was qualified. He explicitly said she was qualified, but he wanted to inflict pain on Barack Obama.
The Merrick Garland thing. Merrick Garland was a moderate choice. President Barack Obama really did. And if you're a conservative and you disagree, that's fine. But I looked it over. I really believe President Barack Obama, in his heart, felt he was offering a compromise candidate. He wasn't just going, I want a hard left ideologue. I think he felt he was trying to offer something that the Republicans could say, I could live with that. And I think Merrick Garland was that person. I think he had a reasonable record, and it was someone that they should have approved. And they just didn't do it to stick it to him. You're absolutely right. What about when COVID-19 is happening? Donald Trump's president, and I get he didn't do that great a job. But you have California, Oregon, and Washington, 3 states. All governors come together. They go on TV. And they say, we signed a joint memorandum saying we're going to ignore whatever the federal government tells us on COVID-19 and do our own thing. That's nullification, right?
I wouldn't call that nullification. I mean, I can see why you would draw a parallel there, but they're not really refusing to let an agency operate.
We're not going to do whatever the federal government says, even though the Constitution says we should. We're just going to defy them. I mean, that sounds real close to the way they talked in 1860, no?
I feel like they were doing it within the confines of the law. So it was mostly, I mean, given that we have a federalist structure, states have a certain amount of autonomy. So again, this is not my area of expertise, so I could be wrong.
Fair enough.
If I recall, they did stay within the boundaries of what was legal in doing what they did.
To preemptively say, we're not going to follow the federal rules. So even if you come up with future federal rules, we're not following them. We're going to do our own thing. It's roughly what they said. I mean, that doesn't say, hey, compromise, willing to work with the team, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Really? What about, I'm sorry. Roe v. Wade
it was a
came
difficult situation because, I mean, you probably remember Trump's press conferences during the COVID period. So
I do remember he wasn't that great. He wasn't. He was pretty inartful. Why don't you drink bleach? I think he said at one time.
Yeah. So,
I will point out, though, that the horse tranquilizer thing, they were wrong on that. So I understand they tried to play that, but that didn't pan out. He did say a lot of stupid stuff. Some of the stuff they said about him wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
What about Roe v. Wade? Obviously, I'm for a woman's right to choose. Roe v. Wade gets overturned. kick back to the states. The lieutenant governor here in California, second highest ranking politician, super left state here in California, says, quote, "I will defy your rulings. I, the second most powerful politician of the world's fifth largest economy, will defy the rulings of the Supreme Court." Nullification? Not?
I mean, theoretically, the lieutenant governor is the second most powerful, but it's really a very nominal position. It's sort of like being president of India. It's
Sure.
a powerful title, but one reason he may have done that is that he knew his position was nominal. So what you could say in defense of him is that he was trying to practice civil disobedience, and I think there's a history of civil disobedience and defense of rights, so you could pull that defense.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a difficult situation when you think rights are at stake and you feel like the Supreme Court has made a ruling that violates your natural rights. Having said that, because we are a nation in which we are bound by the Constitution and by the decisions of the Supreme Court, even if we dislike them.
Right.
I think it's fair for states to do what they can within the boundaries of the law to make abortion legal if it's, if that's what their voters support, and make it illegal if that's what voters support. But I don't think, I don't think the lieutenant governor or the governor of the state should claim that they're above the law or above the rulings of the Supreme Court.
I'm just wondering, like Mike Pence, vice president, he goes, "Well, I don't really have authority. I'm going to go tell everybody, ignore any law that comes out from the Democrats. Just ignore it, even if they legally got it passed. But I don't really have any authority." I mean, that still sends a bad signal, right? It's the second highest ranking official saying on TV, defy the court. That's unconstitutional. You are directing people as an elected official to not follow the law. Mm-hmm. That can't be good, right?
Not a good thing. No.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. That's not.
I wanted to ask you about Norman Ornstein. I am so happy you brought it up. I need to get this book. Thank you. I didn't know about that. I can't believe you were able to interview him. Man, I want to interview that guy so bad. For this reason.
Yeah.
There we go. So you're talking about how we had George W. Bush. I think you were saying George W. Bush was not elected by the popular vote. Donald Trump was not elected by the popular vote. So people are going, well, how come we're getting these presidents in who really the people didn't want? And why did we get Supreme Court nominees like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett approved when people didn't like them? I mean, most of the population does not like the fact that the Supreme Court is now more conservative than it has been since the 1970s. So people are going, how does this happen? Well, Norman Ornstein said, well, it's because of the Constitution. You got about 35 states. They have a fraction of the population. And because of the Constitution, they win. They win the Senate. They win the court. They win the presidency. Doesn't matter if they don't have the population. And he says, going off, like you said with the book, it's going to get even worse. So I want to repeat a statistic I use in every talk. By 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% of Americans will choose 70 senators. And that 30% will be older, whiter, more rural, more male than the 70%. So when we look at the Midwest and South and how they like Donald Trump and his dog whistling of racism, and they didn't really like minorities and LGBTQ and immigrants, he's saying that's going to continue till the year 2040, or roughly when NASA has a plan to have a fully functional base on Mars. No, I'm not exaggerating. That's when we're looking at it. So things get worse. What he's talking about is we have more minority babies, but they won't be minority voters until 2040. So we're not actually having the demographic shift we thought with Obama until roughly 2040, when there's simply more non-white voters and we have to have this integration. Up until such time, you have about 35 states. Young people leave. Minorities don't go because they're scared of the racism. Immigrants don't go because they're scared of the racism. LGBTQ don't go because they're scared of the racism, or they leave. These people own 2/3 of the Senate. an enormous amount of the Electoral College, basically ensuring that they can get the presidents and the Senates and the Supreme Courts that they want, even if they're only 30% of the population. Not good, right?
Yeah, I mean, regardless of whether those 30% were substantially older or younger or whiter or not whiter, it's bad to have a situation where 30% of the people choose 80%, choose 70% of the senators. And Norm Ornstein here is appealing to liberal urbanites with this statement, but you never want any 30% that's skewed to be choosing 70 senators. Now, despite this projection, you could look at it in a few ways. Like, the projection makes it sound like the Senate will just be Republican dominated, but actually, until we actually still have two Democratic senators from Georgia, which is a pretty conservative state, likely to, if anyone other than Trump is the candidate in 2024, likely to go for Trump. So there are Democratic senators or Democratic candidates for the Senate who are able to appeal to voters in states like Missouri or Texas or Georgia who can win. So it's not as dire as you might think. But yeah, it is still not the best situation. It's not the situation that you see in most countries. And it's a legacy of the way the United States was formed, which is a confederate, kind of like the European Union, a confederation of very independent states. And this only makes sense in that situation.
I've heard the Georgia went blue, but the thing is, when I look at the numbers, it looks like it barely went blue by like 51, 52%.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a landslide. I mean, that's you barely won.
Mm-hmm.
And they also put, well, the president, yeah, he barely won. So we have two Democratic senators who barely got over half, and we have a president who barely got over half.
Yeah.
That does not say to me strong blue state. It says to me state that's hardcore red and is starting to go blue. Is that fair or inaccurate?
I think what's remarkable about it is that the last time Georgia went blue was in the 90s. So roughly 30 years ago now.
Right.
So that's what's remarkable about it. It's not the percentage per se. Yeah.
Fair enough. I'd like to show you a map, if I may have your permission, Professor, and I wanted to ask you a question about it. Okay, here we go. This is the famous map I show everybody. And thank you for the Georgia answer. I can't ever get anybody to corroborate that. And, I appreciate that. Okay, here is the map. Have you heard of a thing called the Big Sort?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Okay. How would the basically Americans are ideologically sorting themselves out, maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big theme in Ezra Klein's book too. That we have stacked identities, but all of those overlap. All those identities are now neatly sorting into Democratic piles and Republican piles. So, like whatever stack of identities you have, for each of them, you're going to run into. Like if one of your identity is school teacher, you're going to go to school, run into a bunch of school teachers who share your ideology. Another identity is, member of a bowling league. You're likely to go to a bowling league where everyone is your ideology and so on. So that's new. Yeah.
This is a map of, let me get that to pull up, sorry. So this is from the New York Times, came out in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically backed up the Big Sort. The Big Sort came out in the 90s or early aughts. And this came out 15 years later and basically corroborated the information. It's also been corroborated by 538 and NPR and many other, I think also Washington Post. Basically, so this is a map, top left corner, in the top left corner. This is a map of county votes for presidencies. So it's at the county level. And it's what we call landslide election counties, where one party wins by 20 percentage points over the other, meaning there's no real competition. So red means don't run here if you're not a Republican. You have no chance of winning. Blue means don't run here if you're not a Democrat. You have no chance of winning. Gray means sometimes we like what Barack Obama says. Sometimes we like what John McCain says. It depends on where we think the country is and what message we think the president has, and does it fit for the country? Democracy. Now, if we look at 1992 and you scroll all the way down directly underneath it to the map that's the biggest at the bottom, that's 2016. And you can see how from 1992 to 2016, we've almost completely wiped out all competitive counties across America because of the sorting. If polarization is due to that, how do we undo that? I mean, how do we get millions of people to start re-diversifying themselves, or at least doing it in their mind, given this is a 30-year trend including millions of people? How do we fix this, Professor?
Well, one of the ways to interpret this is that people had a very clear choice in 2010s, from 2010 to 2020. In the 1950s and 60s, the parties overlapped a lot. And due to both activists and some political scientists, the parties actually started to change to present a clear choice to voters. And that split took a long time. So in the 90s, 92 and 96, there were a lot of moderate Democrats and a lot of moderate Republicans. So to some degree, the parties still did not present a very clear choice, which was, you can argue that's a good thing or a bad thing. But one reason you saw a lot of counties not being landslide counties was that the parties themselves just overlapped a lot. So in a way, it didn't matter that much who you voted for in some parts of the country. Even in 2000, there were some, moderate-ish conservative Democrats left in the Senate. But that was roughly the end of that period. So it's not surprising now the parties do present a very clear choice to voters. You're not going to see a lot of people still confused about which party they support. They're just now a narrow group of people in the middle that both parties are hoping to get those people to show up to the polls and vote for them, because those are the people who turn the elections. So you could argue it's not necessarily a bad thing that people now know whom they want to vote for. Having said that, I will say that it would be nice if we had something like, just one sense, something like the 1960s again, a situation where we had a lot of moderates in both parties. That would enable compromises, that would enable legislation to actually pass, that would diminish cynicism in politics. So one problem we also have now is cynicism that the government will get anything done. So it's true. This can be both a sign that voters have a clear choice, or a sign that there are just very few moderate candidates left.
People are looking at that and going, this is why we have people who hate each other now on the other party. This is why people view the other party as the enemy and an enemy of the state versus just an opposition thing. This is why we're seeing trends. There was a new one out this week. People will not marry or date someone outside their party. And it's now a majority of Americans. It used to be a minority. Now it is a clear, overwhelming majority of Americans. Don't date, don't marry, hell no. And I don't even want to know you're on the other party. And I'm more likely to assume that you're evil than that you're just different. And that's the effect of polarization. So we're starting to see it get down to the people. And I'm just wondering how we can undo this. Before you answer, I'd like to show you a few more maps, if I may, Professor, real quick. So this is the map on the far right. The far right is 1968. I know this is a little messy. I apologize. So the map on the far right with a little bit of the orange in the south, that's 1968. The map on the far left is the year 2000, and the map in the middle is 2020. Now, I picked 1968 because I was told that it was the most polarizing and politically charged election in American history. In the pivotal 1960s, 1968 was the year where the choices were stark. That's according to political historians, not my opinion. You can see a lot of light pink and light blue. Yeah, people made choices, but they weren't super hardcore wedded to their choice. Then we go to 2000. There's a lot less pink and light blue. It's a lot of hard red and blues. And then we go to 2020, and there's almost no light pink and no light blue at all. I was told the 1960s was a pivotal, chaotic year, people coming at each other hardcore. Looks like a way more tame America than anything we've experienced in the last 2 decades, according to these maps.
Well, I think 1968 gets that reputation because of the assassinations, the riots of the Chicago Convention, riots in general around America, the Vietnam War. So those things are now salient because now we look back and we look at those things as salient. And even then, though those things got a lot of news coverage, but that was still a period when, as I said, there was a lot of overlap between the parties.
Thank you.
People may have been very polarized about the Vietnam War. Lots of other violence in general, but there was enough overlap between the parties that you still saw a lot of people in the middle. Nixon was, as we now know, very ethically compromised, to say the least. But he wasn't as, in some ways, in domestic policy, he was really not that conservative.
True. They call him a progressive, historically.
Yeah. So he did not try to undo things that LBJ did in terms of the Great Society. So he was, not nearly as right-wing as we might think.
That's incredible because you talk to people who lived during that time, and Nixon is a very polarizing figure. But going off what you said, Professor, it makes a lot of sense. No, he wasn't. He was a polarizing figure on Vietnam, but he wasn't undoing the Great Society programs from Johnson. I mean, he was the most hardcore Republican at the time, and still, like you said, they had overlap. You had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and somewhat of the party overlap versus such a divided choice now. Can we go back to this? Can we go back to somewhat overlap between the two parties? We don't have to freak out because your guy won. We have a couple liberal Republicans. We have a couple conservative Democrats. It seemed that the country was more functional at that time. And one thing I've heard about the 1960s was, yes, it was way more violent than now, but some professors have said they feel that now is more dangerous than the 1960s because in the 1960s, you had belief in common institutions. We believe in the Congress. We believe that the Supreme Court makes a ruling. We got to follow it. If the president was elected, we don't spend the next 4 years going, I don't think he really won, and I'm just going to go tell everybody that even if I don't have evidence. They didn't do that. They had common respect for common institutions, and we don't have that anymore.
We have social media, so it is easier for for a conspiracy theorist to gain a just huge audience very quickly. That was not, you could have been a conspiracy theorist in the 60s, but at least it took hard work to get an audience. And so social media changes things a lot. But when it comes to reasons to be hopeful,
yes.
Every generation is different from the previous generation in some ways. I don't want to exaggerate generational differences, but future generations might find a way to solve this problem. Some signs that the very youngest generation is actually voting Democrat and not slowly getting more conservative as they get older, and more consistently voting Democrat even as they're getting older. Another thing that may happen is that there's a movement to sort of tweak the electoral college to a compact such that all of the electoral votes in a state go to the majority, the person who wins the national majority.
Right.
That compact goes into effect if enough states pass that, and the Supreme Court doesn't claim that it's unconstitutional. Then you're going to have someone who tries to appeal to every single voter across the United States. And what you have now is, the Republican candidate doesn't even have to campaign in Kentucky or Oklahoma or Alabama and Mississippi. They don't have to try to appeal to individual voters in that state because they know they're going to get the electoral votes. And the Democratic candidate doesn't travel to California or Oregon or Washington.
True.
Or New Hampshire or Delaware or Illinois because they know they're going to win those states. So now there's so many states that are clearly red or blue that individual voters in those states don't matter to candidates.
Right. Right. We see that a lot in California.
Yeah. So once individual voters start to matter again, then you'll see presidents caring about interest across the country. So, that's a big if. I don't know if that compact will eventually pass, but that's one possibility. I think maybe sometime in our lifetime, Election Day will become a national holiday. I'm not really hopeful about voting becoming compulsory, whether that will ever happen during my lifetime. But I think just Election Day being made a holiday will improve turnout a lot. And that will force politicians to appeal to more moderate voters because turnout will be higher. So there are some reasons to be hopeful. And education has pros and cons, but overall, more people are going to college, and more people are able to think a little more critically now. So it's possible that will insulate us from some bad outcomes. I don't know. That's again a very big contingency. I don't know if that will actually occur, but education helps a little. So there are some reasons to be hopeful.
I think it still comes down to those 35 states. As Norm Ornstein was saying, you might have a majority of the population that is educated, but in 35 states, they won't be. And according to the Constitution, they'll run everything. And in order to change that, I've heard about that compact where the states would say, our electoral votes goes to the popular winner. That's going to politically neuter some of those states for them to give up that power. And they're going to have to be okay with that. And the question I asked other professors is, how do you convince a state that's small and doesn't deserve that much power and has outsized power now to give it all up for the good of the country? And I was always told that's going to be a hard sell.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any questions for us? Is there anything you wanted to cover, something you wanted to say, an issue you wanted to go over again, something you felt wasn't clear, or anything you wanted to ask for us? Anything at all?
I can't think of anything, but I wish I had a book to plug or something, but I don't.
You are welcome back anytime.
Just a professor. Come study my university. That's the appeal I can make.
We will.
Appreciate you having me on. I really appreciate that. Having me on, and I'm glad to come back anytime.
Last two questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person, and you have listened to this interview, and you thought it was really good, but then you go, I don't remember everything about the interview. This professor was saying a lot of good stuff, but there was this, I can't remember it all clearly, but there was this one thing the professor said. It's 5 days from now, and I can't get it out of my head. What is that one thought you want a random person you've never met before watching this video to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days from now?
That's a good question. If I had to pick one thing, I would say it's the fact that both parties are not equally to blame for polarization. It is Republican tactics, starting with Newt Gingrich in 1994, going through the president, that have really been the most extreme tactics. So at the national level, the federal government level, it is Republicans who are responsible for this. So yeah, that would be the one thing.
I hope you felt this was a fair interview. We didn't do gotcha journalism, didn't try to put words in your mouth. You got to say your piece. Is there anybody you might be able to recommend from any background who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation?
I used to host a podcast called Half Hour of Heterodoxy. Pretty much everyone I interviewed for that podcast, we had about 100 episodes, They're all good candidates. So I would go through there. Laura Schwartz will be a good person. I interviewed her about false equivalence. Matt Grossman would be good if he's available. Norm Ornstein, of course. Um, I don't. Do you cover topics other than politics?
I can. Right now, the series is on political polarization. I also do a dabble in a little bit of foreign policy, American foreign policy.
Okay. Yeah, April Kelly Wasner. She was one of my early interviewees. She would be great. John Zimmerman. He was my very first episode. He would be good. Glenn Lowry, if you can get him. John McWhorter. I know he writes a lot of books, so he's very busy.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Trying to think the other politics people I interviewed.
And what was the name? Federal Orthodoxy?
No, Half Hour of Heterodoxy.
Half Hour of Heterodoxy. Got it.
Yeah, not the most. It doesn't roll off your tongue. Yeah, it's
it's an academic name. That's for.
Maybe I picked a different name, but yeah.
Okay, Half Hour of Heterodoxy with Chris C. Martin. I will find that.
That you just find on any podcast platform. Just search for Half Hour of Heterodoxy. It was published by Heterodox Academy, which is an organization that John Haidt and I founded in 2015. And they don't do the podcast anymore, but the organization is still around, and the podcast, you can get it anywhere you subscribe to podcasts.
What is the Heterodoxy?
Heterodox Academy is an organization that promotes civil debate in academia and freedom from censorship. So, and it sounds like Heterodoxy Academy, but it's actually Heterodox Academy. So there's no Y at the end.
Oh,
Heterodox.
sorry. Yeah, it's bad spelling.
So if you go to heterodoxacademy.org, on Twitter it's HDX Academy, so it's a little easier to type in if you're on Twitter. They're an educational organization, so they focus on higher ed, trying to promote civil discourse, openness to multiple political and religious viewpoints and moral viewpoints.
And we can find that at heterodoxacademy.org, or you can go to Twitter and you can type in #HDX Academy. And both of those should send you to the Heterodox Academy, which is an attempt to get academics to come together across the political divide.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Okay. Any other plugs?
I wish I had some, but I don't. So thank you.
We'll leave it there. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for being willing to take theoretical questions. Thank you for being willing to have a thinking cap on. Like you said, we don't exactly know what the future holds and where it goes. But I wanted people to be informed about the possibilities. And this was a really good interview. And it's definitely from a particular take. And that's exactly what I wanted for people. So I appreciate you coming on and providing opinions and evidence and reason and walking people through a way to think about this. And I didn't even know about that book. It's even worse than it looks or was now.
Yeah.
We'll leave it there. I will email you shortly a copy of the video, and I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Sure. It's been great. Take care.
Okay, take care.
Okay, bye.
So that's it. I did need to bring something up. Sorry, 1 second. Here you go. This is a reference for when I said that it had been removed. So we'll leave it there. And that'll be it.